All right, let's dive into Ezekiel chapter 9. And I've got to tell you, this is one of the most intense, in your face visions of divine judgment you'll find anywhere in the Bible. It's dramatic, it's sobering, and we're going to unpack it together. So, that question really gets to the heart of what's happening in Ezekiel 9. This isn't just some ancient story about Israel. No, it's a vision that forces us to grapple with huge ideas like justice, mercy, and what it really looks like to be faithful when it feels like the whole world has lost its way. So let's get into it. Okay, so the vision kicks off with a command that is just bone-chilling. Remember, in chapter 8, Ezekiel just got a tour of all the disgusting idolatry happening right inside the temple. And right after seeing all that, he hears this booming voice calling for, basically, the executioners of Jerusalem. Yeah, there's absolutely no mincing words here in verse 1. This isn't a suggestion, it's a direct summons for God's agents of justice to show up with their weapons ready. The tone is set immediately, and it is grim. There's no other word for it. But then, right away in verse 2, we see something fascinating. You've got these 6 figures armed and ready for destruction, but then there's a 7th guy. He's dressed differently, in pure linen, and instead of a weapon, he's carrying a writer's inkhorn. You know, like a pen and ink. And right there, that's the central conflict of this whole chapter. Total destruction on one hand, and divine preservation on the other. And get this, the setting is so important here. It shows just how precise God's justice is. These agents don't just pop up anywhere. They show up at the North Gate. Why? Well, that's the exact spot where Ezekiel saw that image of jealousy back in chapter 8. It's where all the corruption really kicked off. So judgment starts right where the sins started. And then they go stand by the brazen altar, a place that was supposed to be for forgiveness, for atonement. Now it's become ground zero for retribution. The symbolism is powerful. So you'd think the destruction is about to start, right? But hold on. Before a single weapon is lifted, something else happens first, an act of mercy. The focus of the vision suddenly shifts from the guys with the weapons to the one guy with the inkhorn. And this next part is heavy. The glory of God, his actual tangible presence that was supposed to dwell in the Holy of Holies, it starts to leave. It physically moves to the doorway of the temple. And that is a terrible, ominous sign. It means God's protective presence is pulling back from this place he once called home. The sanctuary has been so defiled, it's lost its divine protection. It's completely vulnerable now. This brings us to verse 4, and this is absolutely crucial. The man in linen is given a mission. Go through the entire city of Jerusalem and put a mark on the foreheads of a very specific group of people. Who? The ones who sigh and cry. The ones who are genuinely, deeply heartbroken over all the sin they see. And let's be clear, this mark isn't some magic charm. It's a seal. It's a sign of divine ownership. It's God basically saying, this one belongs to me. It's what sets the faithful apart to be saved. This whole idea of a divine seal isn't a one-off thing in the Bible. It's actually a recurring pattern. Think about it. You've got the Passover, right? Lamb's blood on the doorposts marked the homes that would be safe. Here in Ezekiel, it's ink on the forehead. And then, fast forward to the book of Revelation, and what do you see? God's servants are sealed on their foreheads before the final judgments are poured out. It's this consistent theme. God always marks his people for preservation. Okay, so the faithful have been marked. They're set apart. And now the vision shifts into its most terrifying phase. The command for destruction is finally given, and it is absolute. Just listen to how precise and chilling this command is. Slay utterly. That means everyone, old, young, it doesn't matter. No one is exempt. But then, come not near any man upon whom is the mark. So the separation is total. And then comes the real shocker. And begin at my sanctuary. Wow, judgment doesn't start on the streets or in the palaces. It starts in God's own house, with the very leaders, the elders who were supposed to be guiding the people, but were leading them astray instead. And here's the thing. This vision wasn't just a scary dream. It became a brutal, repeating reality in history. Ezekiel's prophecy came true for sure when the Babylonians destroyed the temple around 586 BC, but the pattern didn't stop there. The temple was desecrated again in 167 BC by Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who put up an idol to Zeus. And then, in 70 AD, the Romans came and destroyed the Second Temple completely. It's like Ezekiel saw this terrible pattern that would just haunt Jerusalem for centuries. If you want to see just how accurate this was, just look at the historical record in 2 Chronicles 36. It reads almost exactly like Ezekiel's vision. It talks about the Babylonian conquest, how they had no compassion on anyone, young, old, and how they killed people right there in the house of their sanctuary. It's chilling. It's confirmation that what Ezekiel saw in this vision actually happened in real life. So, can you imagine seeing all of this? Even as a vision, it's horrifying. Ezekiel is just undone. He's basically left standing alone in the middle of all this carnage, and his reaction is just pure, raw anguish. He literally falls on his face and cries out to God. He's basically screaming, "Are you going to destroy everybody? Is there anyone left? Is there any hope for a remnant?" It's just this desperate, heartbreaking plea from a guy who, at the end of the day, loves his people, even with all their sin. And this moment right here, it really highlights the huge gap between how we see justice and how God sees it. From our human point of view, we usually want a lighter sentence, right? We kind of get used to sin, we tolerate it, and we really only see the immediate damage. But God's perspective is totally different. He sees sin for what it is, a poison. He sees its full destructive power, how it ripples out, destroying families, corrupting whole societies, and echoing for generations. For true righteousness to be restored, his justice has to be complete. So, God's answer to Ezekiel is pretty firm. He says the reason the judgment is so severe isn't just because of what they did, it's because of what they believed. They had literally convinced themselves that God had just checked out, that he had forsaken the earth and couldn't see them. This kind of practical atheism, living as if God doesn't exist or doesn't care, that was the root of all the corruption, and it demanded a response. You know, to really wrap our heads around this idea of long-term consequences, this divine perspective on justice, let's look at a quick case study from Israel's history. It makes it crystal clear. Okay, check this out. Way back, centuries before Ezekiel, King Saul gets a direct command: completely wipe out the Amalekites, a longtime enemy of Israel. But what does he do? He disobeys. He spares their king, a guy named Agag. At the time, it probably looked like a small act of mercy, maybe even a smart political move. But here's the kicker. Because that enemy bloodline survived, hundreds of years later, a man named Haman the Agagite, a direct descendant of that same king, shows up in the book of Esther. And his big plan? To annihilate every single Jew on the planet. Think about that. Saul's one act of incomplete obedience almost got his entire nation wiped out generations later. That's the kind of ripple effect God sees. And that brings us back to Ezekiel 9 and to the vision's solemn and, well, inevitable conclusion. The whole thing wraps up in verse 11. The man in linen, the one with the inkhorn, he comes back. His job was preservation, and now he gives his final report. And it's so simple, so final. He just says, "I have done as you commanded me." That's it. The marking is done. The judgment has been carried out exactly as ordered. So what are we supposed to do with a vision like this? It leaves us with a really personal, really urgent question, doesn't it? The people who were saved, they weren't saved because they were perfect. They were saved because they were heartbroken by the evil around them. So if the Bible says judgment begins at the house of God, the takeaway for us today seems pretty clear. The question we have to ask ourselves is, have we grown comfortable, maybe even numb, to the evil in our own time? Or do we still have a heart that can sigh and cry over it? Because according to this vision, that's the real mark of the faithful.